I want you to close your eyes for a second. Just try to imagine the oppressive, suffocating heat of a crowded stone courtyard in the first century.
Oh man, that Jerusalem heat is no joke, especially during a festival.
Right. It's intense. You are standing shoulder to shoulder in this massive, restless sea of people, and the Mediterranean sun is just beating down on the Roman pavement right beneath your sandals.
And the air is probably incredibly thick.
Exactly. It tastes like dust, it smells of unwashed bodies and, nervous sweat. The whole place is pulsing with this crackling electric tension. It's a city basically teetering on the absolute brink of a violent riot.
Because it's Passover.
Yeah, it's Passover in Jerusalem, so the city's population has swollen to, 3 or 4 times its normal size.
Easily. Pilgrims are crammed into every single available corner.
Right, and the occupying Roman army is on high alert. They've got their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. And up on this high stone balcony, heavily flanked by the armed guards of the empire, stands the Roman governor,
Pontius Pilate.
Pontius Pilate. And he presents two bruised, bound men to the crowd. He's looking down and he's asking all the thousands of people gathered there to make a singular choice.
It's just such a heavy, defining moment.
It is, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the most famous pivotal trials in the history of human civilization.
Absolutely.
And usually when we picture the scene in our heads, we think we know exactly how it plays out, right? We know the lines, the characters, the exact stakes of the drama.
We've all heard the Sunday school version.
Exactly. But what if the story you thought you knew, the one printed in millions of books around the world, had a hidden, almost unbelievable twist?
A twist that changes literally everything about the scene.
Yeah, a twist so provocative that it was actually literally erased by history.
It's wild. It completely reframes the entire narrative architecture of the moment. We are so incredibly used to that sanitized version of this event that we completely miss the high-stakes drama.
The psychological and political drama.
Right. And the theological drama. It was all unfolding on that Roman pavement. And the sources we're diving into today, they pull back the curtain on a detail that shakes the foundation of the whole scene.
We are looking at a literal tale of two Jesuses in this deep dive.
Which still just blows my mind.
I mean, it's crazy because according to some of our oldest, most reliable ancient manuscripts, the infamous hardened prisoner brought out next to Jesus of Nazareth wasn't just a guy named Barabbas.
Nope.
His full name, explicitly recorded in the original Greek text of the 27th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, was Jesus Barabbas.
I want you to just picture the scene again with that specific information injected into it. Pilate presents two men.
Both bound in Roman chains.
Right, both standing before the judgment seat, battered, waiting for their fate.
Yeah.
And both men have the exact same first name.
Jesus.
Jesus. But they represent two entirely different paths for humanity. Two totally opposing philosophies of how to save a broken world.
So our mission today is to unpack the profound literary, historical, and theological irony of this specific moment.
And as we dig into the ancient politics and these crazy manuscript cover-ups, we want to ask you, the listener, to step into that dusty courtyard.
Yeah, to honestly consider which kind of salvation you would have actually chosen.
It's a tough question when you really look at it.
It really is. Okay, so let's unpack this, because I've been reading through the research notes you brought on this, and my mind is honestly still spinning.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. Because to understand why that crowd made their infamous choice, we first have to understand exactly who was standing on that Roman balcony.
Yeah.
The similarities go way, way beyond just coincidentally sharing a first name.
Oh, absolutely. It is a brilliant, mind-bending identity paradox.
So let's start with the linguistic breakdown.
Yeah, because the mechanics of the names themselves, that is the skeleton key to unlocking this entire mystery.
Okay, lay it on me.
First, let's look at the name Jesus. In the first century Levant, the Hebrew or Aramaic version of this name was Yeshua.
And that was a pretty common name.
Oh, incredibly common. It was a culturally ubiquitous name in Judea at the time.
I was reading in the sources that it's essentially the ancient equivalent of being named John or Mike today. Like, if you yelled Yeshua in a crowded first century marketplace, a dozen heads would turn.
That's a great way to put it. But its commonality doesn't strip away its profound theological weight.
What do you mean?
Well, the meaning of the name Yeshua was deeply significant to the Jewish people, especially, people living under violent military occupation.
Right, the Romans.
Yeah. The name Yeshua translates directly to the Lord saves, or Yahweh is salvation.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So right out of the gate. Both men standing before the crowd carry a name that intrinsically promises divine salvation.
They are literal walking billboards for the hope of Israel.
Exactly. But then we have to look at the surname the prisoner we traditionally just know as Barabbas.
Okay, yeah.
To understand this, we need to understand how naming conventions actually worked in the Aramaic culture of the time. They didn't have family names like Smith or Miller that passed down unchanged for centuries.
They use patronymic surnames, right?
Precisely.
Meaning your last name was just an indicator of who your dad was, kind of like in Scandinavian cultures where you have Johnson, meaning literally John's son.
That is the exact mechanism. So in Aramaic, the word bar means son,
Okay.
and the word Abba means father.
So if you translate it literally...
His name is son of the father.
Oh my gosh. Wait, so his full legal name?
Jesus Barabbas literally translates to the Lord saves, son of the father.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. I want you to just let the sheer weight of that irony sink in for a second.
It's incredibly heavy.
You have Jesus of Nazareth, a man who has claimed throughout his entire 3-year public ministry to be the divine Son of God, the literal heavenly Son of the Father who has come to earth to bring salvation.
Right.
And right next to him, standing shoulder to shoulder on the judgment seat, is a man whose literal birth certificate name is Jesus, Son of the Father.
It is the ultimate, meticulously crafted parody.
It really is. Matthew presents us with a perfectly symmetrical mirror image. But the sources provide this incredible table of contrasts, showing that while their titles are completely identical, the kingdoms they represent, the mechanics of how they operate, could not be more different.
What's fascinating here is the sheer polarity of their methodologies.
Yeah, let's look at the first Jesus Barabbas.
So he is described in the texts as a notorious prisoner. He isn't a petty thief.
He didn't just steal an apple.
No, he is a political insurgent. He is a man who was actively involved in a violent, bloody uprising against the Roman occupation.
Okay, so his version of the Lord Saves is entirely focused on physical, immediate liberation.
Exactly. He is offering freedom through the edge of a curved sword, through the violent overthrow of Caesar and the literal shedding of Roman blood.
He's an earthly son of the Father.
Representing all the pent-up expectations of an earthly lineage and fierce, burning nationalistic pride.
Right, and then you look at the other side of the mirror. You have Jesus of Nazareth.
Who isn't holding a sword.
At all. In fact, he told his closest friend to put his sword away just the night before in the garden.
Yeah, Peter.
He's described by the prophets as a man of sorrows. He has explicitly stated to Pilate in private chambers that his kingdom is not of this world.
So instead of physical liberation through violence and warfare, he is offering spiritual liberation through personal sacrifice.
Right, he isn't trying to overthrow the Roman emperor. He is trying to overthrow the cosmic forces of death and sin itself.
He is the divine Son of the Father, representing the actual will of God, rather than the immediate, visceral, political will of the people.
I was trying to conceptualize this crazy choice the crowd had to make, and the best way I can wrap my head around it is to imagine a doctor treating a patient with a fatal terminal disease.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Let's say the disease is Rome, the oppression that people are feeling.
Right.
So you have two doctors, they have the exact same name, they wear the exact same white coat. Dr. Barabbas walks in and says, I have a powerful painkiller. It's an aggressive, immediate narcotic.
It's going to stop the pain right now.
Exactly. He says, you will feel strong, you will feel numb to the agony, and we will violently fight the symptoms of this disease together today.
The quick fix.
But then Dr. Jesus of Nazareth walks in and says, I'm not going to give you a painkiller. In fact, what I am offering is going to be agonizing.
Oof. Yeah.
He says, I am offering a massive invasive surgery to remove the actual tumor, the root of the disease, which is the sin and hatred in your own heart.
And the recovery is going to be brutal.
Right. It requires you to pick up your cross daily, but it is the only way you will actually survive.
That is a phenomenal way to look at it, because it perfectly captures the agonizing tension of the crowd's decision.
It was a real tangible choice.
It was. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to deeply analyze the psychology of a traumatized people.
Because they were deeply traumatized.
Absolutely. When you are feeling oppressed, and we have to remember that the Jewish people under Roman occupation were experiencing severe, brutal, daily oppression, what kind of solution do you instinctively, biologically reach for?
The painkiller.
Right. Do you want the immediate, tangible solution that promises to fight your visible enemies in the streets? Or do you want the harder, slower, much more painful path of spiritual surgery?
It's human nature to want the quick fix.
And that is the tragedy of this narrative. The crowd chose the imitation over the incarnation. They took the shadow and actively rejected the substance. Because the painkiller is always more appealing in the moment of acute suffering.
I am completely hung up on this one thing, though.
What's that?
If Matthew designed this profound, perfectly symmetrical mirror, where did it go?
The cover-up.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up hearing the story, reading it in books, seeing it in movies, and I never once heard the guy called Jesus Barabbas until I started digging into these sources for our deep dive.
It's totally missing from mainstream culture.
Right, so if it's such a brilliant literary and theological contrast, did someone actively delete it? Like, who even had the authority to censor the Bible in the ancient world?
This is where we transition from theology into raw, fascinating textual archaeology.
I love this stuff.
So if you go to your bookshelf right now and open a modern traditional translation, like the English Standard Version or the King James Version, you will just see the name Barabbas.
The first name is totally Gore.
Exactly. But the ancient manuscript trail tells a very different, very complex story. The full name, Jesus Barabbas, appears in some of our most important, earliest witnesses to the biblical text.
Like which ones?
Well, for example, we have the Sinaitic Syriac.
Okay.
This is an incredibly ancient translation of the Gospels into Syriac, dating back to the late 4th century. It was discovered in the St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai.
And it has the full name.
It explicitly includes Jesus Barabbas. And the name also shows up in heavily scrutinized Greek manuscripts, like the Codex Corodethi.
Which is from when?
That one dates to the 9th century. But scholars know it preserves a text type that is much, much older.
Wow.
Yeah. Because of this strong, geographically diverse ancient evidence, many modern scholarly texts actually acknowledge the academic consensus.
Like the NIV?
Exactly.
Okay.
The New International Version or the New Revised Standard Version. They include Jesus Barabbas right there in the text or very clearly in the footnotes.
Okay, so if it was in the earliest Greek and Syriac manuscripts, you can't just lose a name like that.
Not by accident, no.
Right, because the mechanics of manuscript copying in the ancient world were incredibly rigorous. Scribes didn't just accidentally drop the central irony of a narrative.
They were meticulous.
So someone had to make a conscious editorial decision to take a knife to the text.
They absolutely did. And scholars have a name for this specific phenomenon. They call it the reverence deletion.
Reverence deletion. Okay, how did that happen?
To understand how and why this happened, we have to look at the psychology of the early church. And specifically at an early church father named Origen.
Origen. Okay.
Origen was this towering, highly influential Christian scholar and theologian living in Alexandria around 184 to 253 AD.
So very early.
Very early. He spent his life meticulously comparing different manuscripts of the scriptures. And when Origen was looking at the manuscripts of Matthew 27, he was absolutely viscerally scandalized.
Really? Why?
Well, imagine your Origen for a second. You have devoted your entire existence to revering the holy name of Jesus. Many of your contemporaries are literally being martyred-fed to lions simply for refusing to curse that name.
Whoa. Yeah, the stakes were literally life and death.
Exactly. And then you open a manuscript and read that a notorious prisoner, a known murderer and violent rebel, shares the exact same holy name as the Savior of the world.
Oh, I see. He couldn't stomach the irony. It felt like blasphemy to him.
It felt like a direct insult to the divine. Origen explicitly argued in his writings that the name Jesus should never belong to a sinner.
So he just decided it was a mistake.
He concluded, utilizing the theological logic of his day, that the inclusion of Jesus Barabbas couldn't possibly be what Matthew originally wrote.
He just assumed the worst.
Yeah, he assumed it must have been a careless scribal error, or worse, a malicious heretical addition meant by enemies of the church to insult Christ.
That is wild.
And because Origen was so massively influential in early Christian scholarship, his dilemma and his proposed solution sent a ripple effect through the monastic copying rooms of the ancient world.
Because they respected his opinion.
Right. You have to remember how copying worked. A monk sits in a scriptorium, painstakingly copying a text by hand, letter by letter. He respects Origen's commentary.
So they just altered the text.
Out of a profound, albeit misguided sense of deep reverence for Jesus of Nazareth, generations of later copyists simply dropped the first name of Barabbas when they were duplicating the manuscripts. They cleaned it up.
Honestly, you have to push back on what those early scribes did, though.
How so?
I mean, I understand their motivation. I understand the cultural trauma of martyrdom and wanting to protect the holiness in the name.
It was a very protective instinct.
But by trying to protect the text from being offensive, didn't they actually destroy the very literary genius that Matthew was trying to build?
They absolutely did.
Because Matthew wasn't a sloppy writer. He was a masterful, intentional author. He didn't just accidentally stumble into this parallel.
No, it was entirely by design.
Right. So by censoring the text to make it more comfortable for a third-century audience, they completely neutered the theological irony that a first-century audience was actually meant to grapple with.
Modern textual critics almost universally agree with you. The overwhelming academic consensus today is that the name Jesus was absolutely original to Matthew's gospel.
It's just such a shame it got erased.
The consequence of that centuries-long erasure is profound. By cleaning up the text, the scribes robbed the modern reader of the central, haunting question that Matthew intended us to face.
Which Jesus do you want?
Exactly. Think about the mechanics of the scene again. When Pilate asks the crowd, "Which one do you want me to release to you?" He isn't just asking them to pick a prisoner out of a lineup.
Right.
He is forcing them to choose between two competing, mutually exclusive versions of reality. If you remove the shared name, it just becomes a binary, almost cartoonish choice between a good guy and a bad guy.
It completely flattens the story. It turns this incredibly multidimensional philosophical crisis into a flat 2D morality play.
It does. But with the name intact, it becomes a choice of which Jesus.
Yeah.
Which version of salvation? And that is a mirror held up not just to the first-century crowd in Jerusalem, but to every single reader who has ever picked up the text since.
It's so powerful. But you know, I'm struggling to fully understand the crowd's perspective, though.
What's tripping you up?
Even with the names being the same, why would thousands of people actively vote to release a known murderer into their own street? There has to be a missing piece of the political puzzle here. Because to fully grasp why the crowd eagerly chose the false son of the father, we have to look much closer at the political climate of the first century.
How can you do?
Because the sources make it very clear that Barabbas wasn't just a random criminal who, knocked over a fruit stand or broke into a house.
Not at all.
I was reading through the notes, and the historical reality of what Barabbas represented is just staggering. He represented a very specific, highly organized, and wildly popular type of violent revolutionary.
This brings us to the crucial historical context that actually makes the entire scene make sense. To understand Barabbas and to understand why the crowd loved him, we have to understand the Zealots.
The Zealots. Okay, tell me about them.
So the Jewish historian Josephus, who was actually contemporary and wrote extensively about this period, described the Zealot movement as the fourth philosophy of Judaism.
The fourth philosophy. What were the other three?
They sat alongside the Pharisees, who were the strict legalists, the Sadducees, who were the wealthy aristocratic priests, and the Essenes, who were the ascetic separatists living out in the desert.
Okay, so the Zealots were their own distinct political and religious faction.
Exactly. And the Zealot movement didn't just start in a vacuum. It was born out of deep systemic grievance. Specifically, it was sparked by a Roman tax census in 6 AD under a governor named Quirinius.
Okay, let's unpack that, because when I hear tax census, I just think of, filling out IRS forms.
Right.
It sounds annoying, but not exactly start a bloody revolution annoying. What was actually happening on the ground?
We have to understand how Roman taxation worked mechanically. It wasn't a neat percentage taken out of your paycheck. The Romans used a system called tax farming.
Tax farming? That sounds corrupt.
Oh, it was horribly corrupt. They would assess a region for a certain massive amount of wealth. Then local collaborators, often wealthy Jews, would bid for the right to collect those taxes.
Wait, they bid on it?
Yes. And whatever they collected above and beyond the Roman quota, they got to keep as pure profit.
Oh, wow. So they were basically incentivized to extort their own neighbors.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
you have local farmers and tradesmen being squeezed dry, forced into debt, losing their ancestral lands, just to feed the belly of the Roman war machine and line the pockets of corrupt neighbors.
That is infuriating. I can see why people were angry.
But for the Zealots, the census of 6 AD wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a profound, existential, theological betrayal. It was literal idolatry.
Idolatry.
Because the coin.
Because of the coins and what they physically represented. The Roman denarius had the image of the emperor stamped on it. and it often came with an inscription declaring him to be the Son of God.
Wow. Okay, yeah.
Their core driving theological belief was beautifully simple but incredibly violent. Their motto was basically, no king but God.
No king but God.
Right. So to pay a coin to Caesar, acknowledging him as the sovereign lord over the Holy Land that Yahweh had explicitly promised to Israel, to them, that was a sin against heaven. And they were willing to kill to stop it.
Absolutely.
And I was reading that they weren't just out there protesting with signs. The sources detail a specific extreme faction of these zealots called the Sicarii,
The Sicarii.
which translates from Latin to the dagger men.
Yes.
When I read this, it honestly sounded like something out of a modern political spy thriller. These guys were basically ancient sleeper agents.
It's terrifying stuff.
It is. They carried these small, curved daggers called sikai hidden under the folds of their cloaks, and the mechanics of their operations were just brutal.
They didn't fight fair.
No, they wouldn't fight the Roman legions on an open battlefield where they would obviously just be slaughtered. They would wait for massive, chaotic, crowded events.
Like the religious festivals in Jerusalem.
Exactly, where hundreds of thousands of pilgrims were packed tight. They would slip seamlessly into the dense crowd, walk right up to a Roman official or a wealthy Jewish high priest they viewed as a collaborator, and assassinate them with a quick thrust of the dagger.
And then, because the crowd was so dense and panicked,
They would just slip their dagger back under their cloak and vanish into the screaming mob, pretending to be horrified bystanders.
it was pure, unadulterated psychological warfare.
Wow.
The goal was to make it so that no collaborator ever felt safe in public.
Yeah.
Ever. And the language of the New Testament strongly, explicitly links Barabbas to this shadowy world of the Sicarii.
Really? Where?
In the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 40, Barabbas is referred to by the Greek word lostos.
Lostos.
Now, if you read older English translations, they often render this word as robber or bandit, and that gives us a completely false impression.
Right, we picture a guy wearing a mask stealing a purse.
Exactly. But in the legal and cultural context of the first century Roman Empire, listos was a highly specific political term. It was the exact word the Romans used to describe political rebels, insurgents, insurrectionists, and guerrilla fighters.
Okay, that changes everything.
And Mark's gospel confirms this mechanical reality too. It explicitly notes that Barabbas was bound in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. He was part of a coordinated rebel cell.
So he was an insurrectionist. If we use a modern analogy, Barabbas was like a radical underground folk hero.
Yes.
To the Roman Empire, he was a terrorist who needed to be executed to maintain order. But to the oppressed people in the streets of Jerusalem, the people who had seen their farms stolen, their families beaten by Roman soldiers, their sacred temple defiled, he was a patriot.
He was a freedom fighter to them.
He was giving the people exactly what they desperately wanted, a bloody, tangible, visceral pushback against an oppressive, crushing empire.
He was the ultimate action hero messiah. He was fighting the visible enemy, Rome, using the only language Rome actually respected, which was violence.
His weapon was the sword and the curved dagger.
Right. His goal was immediate national sovereignty and the total removal of oppressive taxation.
And this is where the contrast with Jesus of Nazareth becomes almost unbearably stark for me.
How so?
Because to show just how radically different Jesus's kingdom mechanics were from the zealot methodology, I want to look at a detail from the sources about Jesus's inner circle of disciples that completely blew my mind.
Well, this is a great point.
We are talking about two specific men that Jesus handpicked to follow him, Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector.
It is the ultimate dinner party of mortal enemies.
It is. Think about what we just learned about the Sicarii and the tax farming system. Simon is a zealot. His entire life's philosophy, the air he breathes, is no king but God.
Right.
And his primary method of bringing about that kingdom is assassinating Jewish collaborators who work for Rome.
And you have Matthew.
Matthew is a Jewish collaborator who works for Rome. He sits in a booth collecting the very coins with Caesar's face on them that the zealots believe are pure idolatry.
He is the physical embodiment of everything Simon hates.
Everything Simon has sworn a blood oath to destroy. Under the Zealot Code, under the philosophy that Barabbas represented, if Simon walked into a room and saw Matthew sitting at a table, he shouldn't have said hello.
No.
He should have pulled a curved dagger from under his cloak and ended Matthew's life right there.
It wouldn't just be an option. It would have been his sacred religious duty to execute him.
But instead, Jesus calls both of them into his inner circle. And he doesn't just call them to tolerate each other in a professional setting. He calls them to be brothers.
They sit at the same table.
They share meals. They wash each other's feet. This is the revolution of the heart that Jesus of Nazareth was bringing.
It's beautiful.
He wasn't interested in a superficial political revolution that just violently swapped one human oppressor for another. He was trying to dismantle the hatred itself. He was proving mechanically that his kingdom could take sworn blood enemies and chemically alter their hearts to turn them into family.
Which perfectly highlights the ultimate devastating tragedy of the crowd's choice in the courtyard.
Yes.
When they stood on that pavement, they weren't just evaluating two men, they were evaluating two fundamentally opposed methods of salvation.
They looked at the path of Jesus Barabbas.
The sword, the violent uprising, the immediate gratification of revenge against the Roman oppressors.
And they looked at the path of Jesus of Nazareth.
Sacrificial love, the revolution of the heart, the incredibly difficult command to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
And they chose the shadow over the substance.
They wanted a Messiah who would break their physical chains with force, and they actively, loudly rejected the one who asked them to pick up their own crosses and die to their pride.
But here's the thing. The crowd didn't just spontaneously get to choose between these two specific figures.
That's true. It wasn't random.
Right. They didn't walk into a voting booth with a blank ballot. This entire scenario, this incredibly dramatic juxtaposition, was orchestrated by a man who was trying to play a very high-stakes psychological game with the public.
Pontius Pilate.
We have to talk about Pontius Pilate, because this was a failed, catastrophic masterclass in political manipulation.
It really was. And we need to dispel a major historical myth here.
What myth is that?
We often have this culturally ingrained, almost sympathetic image of Pilate. We think of him as a somewhat passive, helpless, weak-willed judge who was just bullied by an angry mob into crucifying an innocent man.
Yeah, he's often depicted in art and film as wringing his hands, genuinely distressed and conflicted about justice.
But historically, based on the secular records we have of his governance, that is entirely inaccurate.
Who was he really?
The real Pilate, as recorded by ancient historians like Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, was inflexible, incredibly stubborn, and profoundly cruel. He had zero issue with brutal, overwhelming violence. He was known for executing people without trial.
I read about the incident with the Roman standards in the sources, where he intentionally brought military banners with the emperor's image into Jerusalem just to provoke the religious leaders.
Right, knowing it would offend them.
And then he threatened to mass execute the protesters. So if he is this ruthless, iron-fisted dictator, why is he seemingly trying so hard to let Jesus of Nazareth go in this specific instance?
Because he deeply understood the petty politics of the moment. Pilate wasn't stupid.
No.
The biblical texts explicitly tell us that Pilate knew the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high priests, had handed Jesus over to him out of sheer envy.
Ah!
Jesus hadn't committed a Roman crime, he hadn't raised an army, he hadn't withheld taxes. In fact, he famously said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's."
So the Romans didn't care about him.
Not at all. The religious elite just wanted him dead because he was drawing massive crowds and threatening their internal religious authority.
And Pilate saw right through their hypocrisy.
Completely. He had no desire to act as the personal executioner for the Sanhedrin's internal theological disputes. But he was in a remarkably tricky, dangerous position.
Because of the festival.
Exactly. It's Passover.
Yeah.
The city's population has swelled massively. The atmosphere is a literal powder keg. If he flatly refuses the high priests and just dismisses the case, they have the influence to incite a massive riot.
And if a riot breaks out?
Pilate looks incompetent to his bosses back in Rome, which could cost him his position or his life.
So Pilate decides to use a psychological tactic to force their hand. He attempts what the sources call a reductio ad absurdum.
A logical maneuver where you reduce your opponent's argument to complete absurdity.
Right. He comes up with a bait and switch. He goes down into his highest security dungeons and pulls out the absolute worst, most dangerous, most politically toxic criminal he has.
Jesus Barabbas.
The violent insurrectionist, the Sicarii murderer, and he stands him right next to Jesus of Nazareth, the peaceful teacher who heals sick people and tells his followers to pay their taxes.
Pilate's logic here is entirely coldly calculated.
He assumes that no matter how angry the crowd is, no matter how much the high priests hate Jesus of Nazareth, they wouldn't be foolish enough or insane enough to publicly demand the release of a known, convicted killer.
A killer who brings down the wrath of the Roman military upon their own neighborhoods.
He wanted to use the will of the people as a political shield. He figured the crowd would logically choose the peaceful man.
And then Pilate could turn to the high priests and say, Hey, my hands are tied. The people have spoken. I have a custom to release a prisoner at Passover, and they chose the Nazarene. Case closed.
It's a sarcastic mirror. Pilate is basically standing up there mocking the crowd's theological expectations.
Totally.
He's looking down at them and saying, oh, you guys want a Messiah. You want a son of the Father to lead you? Well, here is your violent rebel who actually fights the Romans with a sword. Is this the king you want? Or do you want this quiet, bruised philosopher?
He genuinely thinks he's checkmating them.
But the trap violently snaps shut on Pilate instead.
He completely underestimated the sheer grassroots influence and the persuasive power of the religious leaders.
The chief priests.
The text in Matthew details the mechanics of what happens next. The chief priests physically move through the dense crowd, whispering, persuading, whipping the people into a frenzy.
Convincing them to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed.
The crowd calls Pilate's bluff. To his absolute shock, they scream for the murderer.
And this brings up a detail in the text that completely changes how I view the climax of this scene.
The hand-washing.
Yes. When Pilate realizes he has completely lost control of his own psychological game and that a riot is starting anyway, he calls for a basin of water. And he washes his hands in front of the screaming crowd.
It's such an iconic image.
No, conventionally, growing up, I was always taught this was an act of genuine guilt or a tragic resignation. Like he's saying, I tried my best to save an innocent man, but I washed my hands of this tragedy. God forgive me.
Right.
But if you look at the cultural context, the act of washing hands to publicly declare innocence of a murder is actually a deeply specific Jewish religious ritual.
It is explicitly outlined in the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21.
This is a crucial, illuminating insight from the sources. We have to remember who Pilate is. He is an aristocratic Roman governor. Romans do not wash their hands in basins of water to absolve themselves of blood guilt in this manner.
No, that is entirely foreign to Roman jurisprudence and pagan custom.
Right, so Pilate, this cruel, violent Roman who absolutely despises the Jewish people he is ruling over, is using their own sacred scripture, their own holy religious ritual, as a weapon against them.
That is exactly what he's doing.
I don't think it's an act of sorrow or guilt at all. I think it is a dark, viciously mocking, deeply cynical gesture.
He is sarcastically acting out a Jewish law.
Yes. He's saying, fine, you want to play these ridiculous religious games, you want to free a terrorist and kill a philosopher, take him. But according to your own precious laws, this innocent blood is on your heads, not Rome's. I am clean.
It's a calculated insult, not a desperate apology.
That interpretation just blows my mind.
Well, it aligns perfectly with the historical reality of who Pilate was.
Mhm.
He was tossing their religion back in their faces.
And the irony of history adds a very dark, fascinating footnote to Pilate's career, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. He didn't actually care about cosmic justice. His attempt to free Jesus of Nazareth was entirely about annoying the Jewish authorities and maintaining his own grip on public order.
But his political instincts were ultimately his undoing.
They were. Just a few years after this trial, Pilate was actually officially recalled to Rome and permanently removed from power by the emperor.
Because he was too weak.
No, he was deemed too cruel, specifically for slaughtering a group of Samaritans on Mount Gerizim without a proper trial.
Wow.
He was a ruthless man whose smartest, most calculated political gamble in the courtyard blew up spectacularly in his face.
So Pilate's political game completely backfires on a practical, earthly level. He releases a terrorist and executes an innocent man. But on a cosmic, theological level, what he accidentally does is orchestrate one of the most profound, intricate living parables in the entire biblical narrative.
It's unbelievable how perfectly it lines up.
Because the trial in the courtyard isn't just a political standoff between a Roman governor and an occupied people. It perfectly, symmetrically mirrors one of the oldest, most sacred, and most mechanically complex rituals in the entire ancient Jewish tradition.
If we really want to understand the depth of what Matthew is communicating to his Jewish audience, we have to travel back in the scriptures, far away from the Roman pavement, to the book of Leviticus, chapter 16.
Okay, Leviticus 16. What's in there?
This chapter explicitly describes the strict, unyielding rituals for the Day of Atonement, known in Hebrew as Yom Kippur.
The holiest day of the year.
For the ancient Israelite, this was the holiest, most solemn day of the entire Jewish calendar. It was the one single day that the high priest was permitted to pass through the heavy veil and enter the Holy of Holies.
The inner sanctum of the temple.
Right, where the presence of God dwelled. And he would enter to make atonement for the accumulated sins of the entire nation.
And at the absolute beating center of this complex ritual were two goats.
Yes. And according to ancient rabbinic tradition, these two goats couldn't just be any random animals pulled from a flock.
They had to be identical, right?
As identical as physically possible. Same size, same color, same value. They were essentially meant to be twins, visually indistinguishable from one another.
The visual symmetry was vital.
Exactly. The high priest, wearing simple linen garments rather than his usual ornate golden robes, would take these two identical goats and stand them before the Lord. He would then cast lots over them.
Essentially a divine coin toss.
Right, to determine their respective fates. The first goat was designated by the lot as the Lord's goat. This goat was the sacrifice.
And we have to understand the theological mechanics of ancient Near Eastern sacrifice here. What? Blood. Because Leviticus states that the life of a creature is in the blood.
Sin, which brings death, requires a life to pay its debt.
So this first goat was slaughtered as a sin offering.
Its blood was carefully collected in a basin, and the high priest would carry that blood into the inner sanctuary. He would physically sprinkle it on the mercy seat to spiritually cleanse the temple and the people from their transgressions.
The Lord's goat paid the ultimate price of sin with its own life. It did not survive the ritual.
But then there's the second goat, which has a completely different, almost haunting role in the ritual, because it doesn't die on the altar.
Right. The second goat was known as the Azazel, or in English, the scapegoat.
Once the sanctuary was cleansed by the blood of the first goat, the high priest would turn to the living second goat. He would approach it, and he would lay both of his hands heavily on the head of the animal.
This was a mechanical act of imputation.
Exactly. The high priest would publicly, vocally confess all the wickedness, all the rebellion, and all the specific sins of the Israelites. Through this physical contact, he was symbolically transferring the entire weight of the nation's guilt onto the head of the animal.
And then this goat, now bearing the sin of the people, wasn't killed.
It was handed over to an appointed man, led away from the temple, taken outside the city walls, and released alive out into the barren, uninhabited wilderness.
It symbolically carried the sins of the people far away from the camp so they could be pure.
Now, I want you, the listener, to hold that ancient, visceral ritual of the two identical goats in your mind.
Hold the blood, the imputation, the casting of lots.
And now, map it directly one-to-one onto the Roman pavement of Pilate's courtyard.
It is the ultimate mind-blowing symmetrical mirror.
It really is.
You have two men standing before the people. Both are named Jesus. Both are presented by a man in priestly garments, in this case, Pilate, the Roman authority acting as the supreme judge, standing on the balcony, casting the ultimate lot.
It is a literal flesh and blood reenactment of Yom Kippur.
It is stunning when you place the two images side by side. Let's look at the specific roles they play. You have Jesus Barabbas. In this living, breathing parable, Barabbas perfectly plays the role of the scapegoat, the Azazel.
But the incredible irony here is that unlike a literal innocent animal goat, Barabbas is actually genuinely guilty.
Yes, he has legitimately committed the horrific crimes of armed rebellion and murder. But look closely at the mechanics of what the crowd does. By screaming for his release, the crowd literally and vocally transfers their own sinful desires onto him.
They take their desire for violent rebellion, their deep-seated anger, their political idolatry, and they align themselves with him.
And just like the ancient scapegoat, because the lot falls in his favor, he is released alive. He walks down from the judgment seat, his heavy Roman chains are struck off, and he walks back out into the wilderness of the world, carrying the violence of the people with him.
And he only gets to walk away, his life spared, because another man takes his place on the altar. Which brings us to Jesus of Nazareth.
In this courtyard ritual, he is the Lord's goat. He is the innocent sacrifice.
Throughout the entire trial, Pilate has repeatedly declared, "I find no fault in him," perfectly mirroring the strict Levitical requirement that the sacrificial animal must be entirely without blemish, completely innocent of any defect.
And instead of being released, he is handed over to the executioners. He is sent to the altar, which in this historical moment is the rough wood of the Roman cross, to pay the debt of sin.
He is led, exactly as the ancient scriptures dictate for the sin offering, outside the camp, beyond the city walls of Jerusalem, to Golgotha to die, shedding his blood to cleanse the people.
This profound parallel raises a vital theological question, though, because while Matthew perfectly constructs this Yom Kippur imagery, he also introduces a massive, devastating cosmic reversal into the ancient ritual.
Yes, the reversal. This is so important.
In the Old Testament book of Leviticus, the scapegoat carries the sin away into the desert so that the people can be pure. The ritual is explicitly designed to remove the impurity and restore a harmonious relationship between a holy God and the nation of Israel.
But in the Gospel of Matthew, in the courtyard of Pilate, the entire dynamic is flipped on its head.
How so? Walk me through the mechanics of that reversal.
By choosing the man of violence, the crowd isn't sending their sin away to be cleansed. They are fully, actively embracing it.
Oh, wow.
They look at the two identical representations of salvation, the painkiller and the surgery, and they actively choose the one that aligns with their own internal darkness.
They vote for the murderer.
They embrace the bloody rebellion. They choose the sword. And by doing so, they send the genuinely innocent sacrifice to die, completely failing to realize that his unjust death will be the very cosmic mechanism that actually accomplishes the eternal atonement they so desperately need.
They think they're just making a pragmatic, immediate political choice about a local prisoner.
But they are blindly participating in the ultimate cosmic mechanism of universal salvation.
That is the literal, undeniable gospel playing out in real time, right there on the pavement. Which leads us to the ultimate theological punchline of this entire deep dive.
It all comes together here.
Because Barabbas isn't just a historical footnote. He isn't just a fascinating answer to a Bible trivia question about who got released at Passover. Theologically and historically speaking, Jesus Barabbas is the very first human being to ever experience substitutionary atonement in its most literal, physical, visceral form. I want you to really think about the reality of his morning. Imagine waking up in a dark, damp Roman dungeon. You are Jesus Barabbas. You are 100% guilty of capital offenses against the most powerful empire on earth.
You know exactly what crucifixion entails. The scourging, the nails, the suffocation.
You know you are scheduled for execution that very day. The wooden crossbeam is literally already built and waiting for your shoulders. You have no hope, no lawyer, no appeal.
You are a dead man walking.
And yet, hours later, the heavy iron door swings open, your chains fall to the stone floor, and you walk out into the blinding Mediterranean sunlight as a completely free man.
Why? Because the true Son of God physically took your cross.
It is the most profound distillation of grace in the entire narrative.
Consider the implications of that morning for Barabbas. He did absolutely nothing to earn his freedom. He didn't repent of his murders. He didn't promise Pilate he would be a better, more compliant Roman citizen.
He didn't offer restitution.
He was saved purely, entirely by the substitution of the innocent for the guilty.
And that is precisely why the ancient scribes of the church, despite Origen's perfectly understandable discomfort and reverence, never should have erased his first name from the manuscripts.
Because the ultimate theological point to the mirror image is that Barabbas is us.
We are the man in the dungeon.
The narrative aggressively forces us to confront a very uncomfortable, ego-destroying truth about ourselves. We love to read ancient history and imagine ourselves as the innocent bystanders.
Or, if we are honest, we like to imagine ourselves as the misunderstood heroes of our own stories, standing faithfully with Jesus.
But the psychological mechanism of the text is pointing a finger directly at the reader and saying, no, we're the ones who deserve the chains. We are the ones harboring deep-seated rebellion, selfishness, pride, and violence in our own hearts.
We are the guilty ones standing shivering on the judgment seat, having broken the laws of heaven.
And yet, despite our profound guilt, we're the ones who get to walk away free, blinking in the sunlight, simply because the true Son of the Father stepped forward, stood in the gap, and took the agonizing punishment that we fully earned.
When we sanitize the text, when we just call him Barabbas and remove the shared name, we artificially distance ourselves from that visceral, uncomfortable reality.
We distance ourselves from the mirror. We make it easy to judge the crowd without realizing we are standing right beside them yelling the exact same thing.
Precisely. We desperately need to see the symmetry. We need to see that it was Jesus, the false savior, the man of violence, who was unconditionally set free by the sacrifice of Jesus, the true savior, the Prince of Peace.
It's a truth we can't afford to ignore.
So what does this all mean for you today, living thousands of years after the dust settled in that courtyard? We've unpacked the ancient Aramaic linguistics, the bloody history of the Zealots and the Sicarii, Pilate's failed psychological manipulation, and the ancient, intricate rituals of Yom Kippur.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, but I want to leave you, the listener, with a final chilling thought to mull over as you go about your day. It's drawn directly from the historical consequences of the two kingdoms we discussed earlier.
The outcome of their choice.
Right. When the crowd in that hot, dusty courtyard voted for Jesus Barabbas, They made their choice. They voted for the painkiller instead of the surgery. They voted for the zealot way.
They voted for the way of the sword, for aggressive national sovereignty, for violent, immediate resistance against their visible enemies.
They wanted the tangible, bloody victory right then and there. But as the historical sources painstakingly noted, that exact methodology, the way of Barabbas, did not bring them the peace, the prosperity, or the freedom they so desperately craved.
In fact, it brought the exact catastrophic opposite.
Decades later, that same simmering zealot ideology, the belief that violence could purify the nation, pushed Jerusalem into an all-out, unwinnable war with the Roman Empire.
And it culminated in the year 70 AD with the total apocalyptic destruction of Jerusalem.
The Roman legions, led by Titus, besieged the city, starved the inhabitants, and ultimately burned the magnificent temple to the ground, leaving not one stone on top of another.
Millions died of famine, crucifixion, and the sword.
The physical, violent liberation they voted for on that pavement led directly to their absolute physical annihilation.
It is a haunting, urgent reminder for us today.
It really is. When we demand our own immediate, aggressive versions of salvation, whether we are talking about our modern politics, our interpersonal relationships, or our deeply held ideologies, and when we actively reject the harder, slower, agonizingly painful path of spiritual transformation and sacrificial love, we might just be setting the stage for our own ultimate destruction.
We think we are choosing freedom. We think we are choosing strength.
But we are actually just choosing the sword that will eventually cut us down.
That's a heavy thought to sit with.
So put yourself back on that hot stone pavement one last time. The dust is swirling. The Roman guards are waiting, hands on their weapons. Pilate is looking down from the marble balcony, holding two battered men before you.
Two paths, two kingdoms, two completely different visions of what it actually means to be saved.
Which Jesus are you choosing today?